what we're going to be starting in the next couple of days. So we've used Nietzsche to give us this sort of like initial insight into what this idea of transcendence possibly could be referring to. Now we're going to actually see how people who aren't Nietzsche characterize it. Because Nietzsche obviously has his own objective. There's his own thing that he's after. Same thing is true for Heidegger. And indeed, same thing is true of everyone, right? Everyone's got their own objective. So we're going to try to look at how these traditions would characterize themselves in terms of this distinction that Nietzsche's drawing between the sensible and the supersensible. That's going to be our goal. So we're going to start with today, we're going to start with the, I guess, at least in the West anyway, the sort of the philosophical foundation of this view. Both Heidegger and Nietzsche called the view that they're sort of attacking in one way or another, what they're calling this idea of philosophical Platonism, or metaphysical Platonism, which may or may not correspond with anything that Plato himself actually said. We'll need to figure out to what extent actually that's even true. But at the very least is a whole bunch of early Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thinkers, and even some pagan thinkers actually, who at the very least are going to claim that they're inspired by what Plato is saying, and using that as a framework to articulate their religious views and their religious sort of traditions. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at what two philosophers basically just said, Plato and Plotinus. We're going to do very broad, rough overview. If you want to actually go in depth, take medieval philosophy with me, we'll do an enormous amount of work going through what Plotinus actually is saying. So we'll do that today, very broad overview of all of this. And then what we'll do on Tuesday is we'll use that broad overview and see how early Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all characterize themselves using this Platonic language. And then maybe also how they modify it a little bit too. We'll need to see that modification. And then also how the late pagans, so the paganism that's in conflict with Christianity, how it also uses that Platonism to redefine itself. So we're going to sort of try to transition a little bit from how is this idea of transcendence connected to an idea to what we now think of as religion in some sense. How do those two things come to become connected? So that's going to be our goal. Anyone have any initial thoughts or questions or anything from last time, or should we just get started? All right, let's get started. So let's just do a real quick review, just of what we've been talking about. So we've been doing this Nietzsche-Heidegger overview. Okay. So for Taylor, he's sort of our example for this class, Taylor tried to define religion in terms of this idea of transcendence. How do you distinguish religious people or religious ideas? All of those ideas, in some sense, point to something that transcends ordinary human life. And this could be any number of things that sort of get pointed to. God would be an example of a transcendent figure, but also the Dhamma in Theravada Buddhism, Brahman in Hinduism, wide variety of things could sort of satisfy this idea of transcendence. So we want to understand what this idea of transcendence means in a sort of more serious sense, right? If this is going to be the distinguishing characteristic, according to Taylor, it was also, at least according to many of your first drafts anyway, a distinguishing characteristic as well. Many of you thought this kind of reference made something religious in a way that other kinds of references were not. We need to get really clear on what we mean by transcendence. We need to get some semblance of it, some idea of it that we can use to make our account of religion a little bit more solid. So we were using Nietzsche and Heidegger to help, in particular using Heidegger's just reading of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche argues that transcendence is what he basically calls metaphysical Platonism. It's the view that the sensible world is not adequate in some sense, that there's something missing, something misleading, something untrue about it, and it requires a supersensible world to explain, to make sense of, to complete, to perfect. Right? He's doing all of this very broadly and deliberately so, because he's trying to include wildly diverse traditions within this, but that in some sense we have a distinction between two worlds, a sensible world and a supersensible world. The sensible world is inadequate, it needs a supersensible world to fix it in some sense. And so when Nietzsche talks about God is dead, I mean, he says this when he really quotes Hegel in saying this, what he means by this is not that God doesn't exist, he doesn't think God exists, but that's not what he actually fundamentally means. What he means is that this whole idea of the supersensible world itself, it no longer has any power for human beings. It no longer does the work it did in the first place of sort of fixing what was broken in the sensible world, right? All these various ways of saying that the sensible world's not good enough. it no longer justifies or excuses the sensible world, particularly with respect to the grounding of ideas or values. Right? If I value justice, why was I supposed to value justice? Well, because justice itself in the supersensible is there, and the supersensible is why I should believe that justice exists. The way this, the most almost sort of pedantic or banal way of putting this, why should I care about justice? Because God says I should care about justice. And indeed, as we were sort of discussing, right, that's actually a pretty decent answer if God indeed exists, and if God is everything Christianity says God is, right? But if God doesn't exist, or at the very least, if the idea of God no longer moves me, I now no longer have anything to justify or give warrant to my claim that justice is valuable, justice is important. And so all of the values that we've been holding on to in this sensible world, they've all seemed groundless because what grounded them was the supersensible. Right? So if you devalue the supersensible world, Nietzsche argues, you also devalue the sensible world. And this is what he was calling nihilism. Right? That just all values seem to be groundless. Right? You can't get rid of the supersensible and leave the sensible behind. They mutually entail one another. They mutually define one another. Important to note, Nietzsche's not actually giving us anything resembling an argument that God doesn't actually exist, or that there is no transcendence, the transcendence doesn't exist. He doesn't believe that God exists. He doesn't believe that the transcendent is real or that the supersensible is real. But that's not what this God is dead argument really is about. This God is dead argument is about the idea of God, or the idea of transcendence, and what role it plays in how human beings go about navigating the world. The idea of God no longer does the job that it once did for us, and this is the nihilistic problem, whether or not God exists or not. And indeed, we were talking about last class about how Nietzsche is sort of this predecessor of existentialism in a lot of ways, and a lot of sort of postmodern philosophy. Postmodern philosophy in general really strongly wants to say there's no such thing as transcendence. And it also really strongly never really argues for it. It's sort of working from the same sort of just Nietzschean sense that just like, yeah, none of us just believe in this supersensible world anymore, so why bother talking about it? The actual justification, at least from my perspective anyway, is frequently quite lacking. And Taylor pointed this out too, that it's not really clear exactly that there are great arguments against the supersensible world. But Nietzsche probably is right that at least for a great many people, this idea of a supersensible world no longer, quote unquote, works. No longer does the job. All right. So that's just review and background. That's sort of just reminding us of what we've been doing in Nietzsche. What I want to do today is I actually want to almost just explain why everyone's calling this philosophical Platonism. Right? By both Nietzsche and Heidegger both think that this is at root a kind of Platonism. And the reason why this is going to be important is because Plato isn't exactly saying what they're saying he's saying. And why does that matter? Why does that matter is that when the early Christian churches and the early Jewish churches and the early Islamic churches, when they're using Platonism, they might not be exactly saying what people started to interpret them as saying by the time you get to the end of the Middle Ages, right? So the early Christian church was indeed Platonic, but it's not saying the same thing that the later medieval church is saying. And it's not understanding that in the same way as the later medieval church. That difference could indeed be important, could matter in how we actually characterize this idea of transcendence, and also in terms of how we actually understand what it is that Christianity is even saying. It's really important to remember this point that we've been making from the beginning of class. What did it originally mean to be religious? It meant to be a monk. It didn't mean to be Christian. It didn't mean to hold Christ in your heart. It meant to be a monk. It meant to lead a very specific way of life in which you were sort of not living in the normal world. That's certainly going to be present in the early church. It's certainly going to be present through a lot of the Middle Ages. But by the end of the Middle Ages, as Taylor was arguing, that notion starts to go away. That's really going to transform what the transcendent is and how we think about it. That's the claim that I want to make. So we'll need a couple days for it. We'll be doing this, really, we're going to start looking at the early Islamic, Christian, and Jewish churches for basically all of next week. That's what we're going to sort of start with, is just looking at there. Today, I just want to get what Plato himself is actually saying, what Plotinus himself is actually saying, and why they're saying it. In other words, almost, why would we ever have talked about the supersensible world in the first place? Why did it ever seem like a good idea to people to talk this way? If we're not just assuming that it's some kind of sickness or whatever, or neurosis or whatever, as Nietzsche's doing, if that's a perhaps unfair reading, why would people have ever offered this kind of supersensible explanation in the first place? So that's going to be our goal for today. I'm going to have to lecture, unfortunately. Plato never writes us anything where he actually says what it is he actually thinks. He writes us a bunch of dialogues. And the dialogues all say a lot of different things. And so figuring out precisely what Plato's actual position is really difficult. I'm actually a Plato specialist. That's actually what I got my PhD in, and that's predominantly what I work on. So that's why we're not going to read any Plato. We're not going to read any Plotinus, because Plotinus very clearly does tell us what he thinks, and it's really, really hard. So we're not going to do any of that in this class either. That, again, if you want to ever read, if for whatever reason you feel like reading some Plotinus in your life, come take medieval philosophy with me, and we will go through Plotinus in great depth. So yeah, but I'm going to try to just to give you a very broad overview of this view. Please interrupt me, though, whenever you feel like it, right? Either just unmute yourself, because you all have the ability to unmute yourself, or send something through the chat or whatever. Whenever you feel like it, whenever you've got a question, unmute yourself, let me know, and we can sort of explain some stuff. What I'm hoping at least by the end of the day, you're going to sort of feel like is like, oh, that at least makes sense. Like maybe I don't see the world this way, but this is a sensible way of looking at the world. So that's the hope, that's the goal. So if you've got questions that I can answer to try to make that clearer, let's do so. That's what I want to do. All right. So let's actually just start, even before we actually do the whiteboard. Actually, I don't even need the whiteboard at first. So let's close this down for a second. Let's just do something really, really basic. All right. So perfect, they are. I got two things right here, right? They're both like markers or pens or something, whatever. That doesn't actually matter. Okay. Would you agree that these things are about equal? Everyone agree? Right? Not exactly, right? You know, there's a little gap, but they're close enough, right? If I was to say these two things, they're about equal, you say, yeah, that sounds about right. Right? Whereas, you know, you bring my Darth Vader pen. These two things, yeah, they don't seem very equal. You with me so far? We all good? I take it nothing complicated has happened yet. Okay, so if I was to write the sentence, and it's going to be important to do this because this is what we're actually concerned with. If I was to write the sentence, those first two pens are equal, would you all agree, again, let's say more or less equal, it doesn't have to be exact. Those two pens are more or less equal. Would you all agree that that is a true sentence? Everyone agree with me? All right. But of course you're wrong to agree with me, right? Because if I turn them around, now these two things don't really seem particularly equal at all. This one seems a lot bigger. So they were equal when you were looking at them like this. But when you look at them like this, they suddenly don't seem very equal. So was the original sentence true or false? Well, here's what Plato would say. He would say it was true in a qualified way. Actually, no, as I've written it, this isn't a true sentence. It's true insofar as I'm talking about the length of the pens. It is false insofar as I'm talking about their width. I have to add qualifications to the sentence to say why it's true. This pen by itself is not equal. It's only equal if I'm comparing it to this pen in a very specific way. Let's do another one real fast. And again, my hope is that you'll all agree the sentence is true. If I say dinosaurs are extinct, sad, but hopefully true. Hopefully you all are agreeing with me. True sentence. So let's write it up. All right. Let's do the same thing. Is that sentence true? Well, thank you for all going along. The people on the video giving me the thumbs up. I appreciate it. Right. But okay. Thanks for playing along. Well, okay. It's true now, right? It's true today when I say that sentence. But if I said that sentence, what, 120 million years ago? Would the sentence have been true then? No, dinosaurs would not have been extinct then, right? And someone saying, what about crocodiles? No, 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 they're not actually dinosaurs. They're like them in some respects, I grant, but they themselves are not dinosaurs, right? I mean Jurassic Park is what I mean. That's what I'm talking about here, right? Dinosaurs are an extinct species, but they're an extinct species now. And actually, let's even just use Jurassic Park for a second. It's not even just if we went back 120 million years. If in 10 years Jurassic Park gets made, they're not extinct then either. The sentence dinosaurs are extinct, it's true right now. These sentences, both of them are true, but in a different respect, they're also false. And it depends entirely on the way in which we look at the sentence. Right? And this is actually really important for Plato. This is one of the ways I think Nietzsche's mischaracterizing him. Plato's not saying those sentences are false. They're just false if taken in a certain way. They're only true in a highly qualified respect. And what kind of qualifications do I have to add? I have to add temporal qualifications. I have to add spatial qualifications. Right? I have to add relational qualifications, like in the case of the pen. And indeed, you should all be familiar with this. My guess is probably at some point in your life, you've all been exposed to the idea of the principle of non-contradiction. So the principle of non-contradiction is the same thing won't do or suffer opposites at the same time in the same respect, or they won't do or suffer contraries in the same time in the same respect. Notice, though, that in that principle of non-contradiction, there are qualifications. I can violate the principle of non-contradiction right now. I'm doing Plato with this, because Plato is the one that actually invents it. I'm going to violate it right now. Am I standing still? Yes. Am I moving? Yes. So therefore, I am moving and standing still. Those are contradictories. Haha, I've violated the principle of non-contradiction. But of course I haven't, right? Because a part of me was moving and a part of me was standing still, right? So the principle of non-contradiction is true, but again, it's true when qualified, right? And when you point out all of the qualifications. So there's all kinds of things that we can do this with, right? We can do, let's just do a few more examples of similar kinds of sentences. And indeed, ultimately, Plato thinks this is true of all sentences, or at least all sentences said about the sensible world. That action was just. Well, indeed, sadly, probably every action we do is just in some respect and unjust in other respects. Right? That's not to say that it really wasn't just in some respect, right? Plato's a moral realist. He thinks justice is a real thing, right? It's just in some respects, but not just in other respects, however, right? You know, if I let's say I feed the homeless, that's a great action, good action, right? But I didn't feed all those other people, so it was a bad action. Right? Depending on the reference, good in some respect, bad in another respect. Let's do an even worse one. This is how I begin every metaphysics class that I teach at an introduction level. I am one thing. Is that true? Am I one thing? Well, yes. Again, I'll stand up. You can see. Ta-da! One. But of course, if you get a magnifying glass, what are you going to see? You're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of cells. And you get an even better one, what are you going to see? Billions upon millions of atoms. Right? So am I one thing or many thing? Kind of depends on how you look at me. Right? But, and again, this is really important, depending on how you look at me, I really am either one thing or many things. Right? I really am one insofar as you're looking at me as an organism considered as a whole. But I really am many insofar as you're considering me as, in terms of my parts, the parts that make me up. Both of those ways of looking at me are correct. They both pick out something true about the world. But neither sentence is true in an unqualified sense. And Plato's basic claim is that every sentence you say about spatiotemporal things will only be true or false in a highly qualified sense. It really will be true or false, but that true or falseness will be qualified and will require various sorts of qualifications. How are we doing so far? Is this idea of the sense that we need to sort of qualify things, is that making any sense? Nothing super controversial in Plato pointing this out. Lots of people would point this out. Okay. The controversial or the weird thing is what Plato's going to do with this idea. Let's go back. Let's do the dinosaur one again. The dinosaur one is my favorite of these to do with people now. Obviously Plato didn't do that one, but I think it works the best for us. It's one we moderns have the easiest time with. All right. So dinosaurs are extinct. And again, let's add the qualification in right now. We might need to add in other qualifications too, perhaps, but let's just say we added all of them in. So I've got some qualified, actually true sentence. All right, so dinosaurs are extinct right now. Why is that sentence true? Try it out. So try giving me an explanation for why that sentence is actually true with the qualification. Be bold.
They don't exist. You can't see them. You can't. You go to a night at, like, if you go to the museum, unless you're Ben Stiller, nothing's going to come alive and like chase you.
Excellent. Good. Why is this sentence true? Because dinosaurs do not exist. All right. Is that a true fact about dinosaurs?
Like at the moment right now that they don't exist?
Right now, is it a truth? Like, can you point to the dinosaur that doesn't exist for me?
You can point to the dinosaur that did exist. You can't point to a dinosaur that does exist.
Good. Or does not.
Or does not.
Yeah, right. Yeah, good. That's exactly right. Like, you can maybe point me to its bones, so it's the fossils of its bones in a museum or something, like you were saying. But the dinosaur itself, if we're saying the dinosaur does not exist, it's not a thing you can point to, right? It's not one of the pointable two things. Okay, but are these two sentences different then? So dinosaurs don't exist. Okay. How does that sentence relate to this sentence? Unicorns do not exist. Do those two sentences mean the same thing? I take it not. And again, in its very real sense, this is supposed to be sort of obvious. Like, obviously those sentences don't mean the same thing. Okay. Unicorns don't exist though too, so both of them are true sentences. I take it, right? We look around, we're not going to find any unicorns anywhere either. In just the same way we look around, we're not going to find any dinosaurs anywhere. All right. Well, how do we know we, so to speak, haven't found any dinosaurs? And how do we know we haven't found any unicorns? What standard are we using to make the determination, oh, this is not a dinosaur? Because again, I take it you'd all agree, this is not a dinosaur. Why? How do I know that? It's not that I'm comparing this dinosaur to some other dinosaur that I've seen down the street or whatever. Like, oh no, this isn't a dinosaur, that Triceratops rampaging through the street is. That's not the case, right? There are no dinosaurs anywhere. Dinosaurs are gone. So how do I know that this is not a dinosaur? And how would I recognize one if I found it? And same thing with a unicorn. How would I recognize a unicorn if I found one of them?
Well, with the dinosaurs, we have their bones, so we can posit that at one point they did exist. Unicorns, we don't have any evidence that they existed in the first place.
Sure. Except perhaps for North Korean fossils that are of dubious of dubious scientific value. But yes, other than that, I agree. Yes. All right, good. So, okay, so what do we know when we look at those bones, though, right? Because you're right. When we look at those bones, though, okay, those bones are themselves not a dinosaur. I take it. So, okay, what is a dinosaur then? What makes something a dinosaur? We use the bones to figure it out. I completely agree. We use the bones to figure out what a dinosaur would have been or was in the distant past. But what did we figure out? Like, what actually is a dinosaur? This is a weird question, right? Go ahead. Yeah, William, go ahead.
If we're trying to figure out what is a dinosaur, and the only process we know, the only way we know how to figure out what a dinosaur looks like is through its bones, I guess the dinosaur would be this imagination we've created based off of some shape in the dirt or some collection of bones.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem accurate at all. Like that, I mean, that's not the way we conceive of what a dinosaur is.
Well, yeah, because I actually can say all kinds of things about dinosaurs that no longer exist that I believe are true, right? So we actually believe dinosaurs had feathers. Sorry for all you Jurassic Park people out there. That is indeed what the best science says. So the sentence, again, let's do this just do this in terms of sentences, because that's how Plato's thinking of all of this. The sentence, dinosaurs had feathers, not scales. All right. Is this sentence true? Well, again, let's say this is what modern science says, so let's assume it's right. Is that sentence true? Yes, that sentence is true. Is that sentence true right now? Sure, it's true today. If we did find a dinosaur, it would have birds instead of scales. Was it true 120 million years ago? Will it be true when all human beings have died? Sure. That sentence is always true. That sentence is, the truth of this sentence does not have any temporal qualifications to it. It's atemporally true. Right? It is always the case that dinosaurs are the kind of thing that has feathers, not scales. That is a always true sentence. Go ahead, Rowan. Go ahead. Oh, you're not muted. So, but for some reason, yeah, you might be. Your headphones are off, maybe.
Okay, is that on?
There we go. You're good.
So what about like before dinosaurs existed?
Yep.
Then would that statement be true?
It was. At least Plato would say, right? Because that's how we're able to say this is before dinosaurs existed. Why is that sentence true? The sentence that now I am before dinosaurs existed is true is because what it is to be a dinosaur was still a category I could refer to.
Okay, I see. Okay, huh.
The idea here, and we're getting to it. That question does a really good job of, I think, getting us at the idea here. The idea that Plato is pointing toward is dinosaur isn't just, or isn't merely, I'm not spelling the word dinosaur right. Why can't I spell this word today? Dinosaur. There we go. This doesn't refer merely to an object in the world. Sometimes it will refer to objects in the world. It'll refer to an object in the world 120 million years ago. Right? If the crazy mad scientist in Jurassic Park made some dinosaurs, it'll refer to things that exist in the world then. But it doesn't only refer to things that exist in the world. That dinosaur, what is it fundamentally? It is a standard or rubric by which we identify things in the world. As being what they are. So why am I one thing? I'm one thing because there's an idea of oneness. and I live up to that ideal in some respects, I fall short of it in other respects. Why do dinosaurs no longer exist? Why are they extinct? Exactly like you were saying, look around. You're never going to find something that lives up to that standard. You will never find anything that said, yep, that satisfies the conditions necessary for something to be a dinosaur. This is true of mathematical things. It's true of numbers as well. I am one insofar as I live up to the standard of oneness. But I am many things. I'm a multitude insofar as I live up to the standards of being a multitude. I'm tall insofar as I live up to the standard of tallness. I'm short insofar as I live up to the standard of shortness. In fact, we can go, to what extent am I human? I'm human insofar as I live up to the standards of what it is to be human. But I'm Homo erectus insofar as I still have an appendix. The vestigial organ that humans themselves don't make use of, that's a reference to our prior ancestors on the evolutionary cycle. And indeed, I'm a human right now, but what will I be in 100 years? If I'm lucky, mulch. Right? Or nothing at all, more accurately. I won't be anything at all in 100 years, right? Because what am I now? I'm a human being. But I won't be that always. I wasn't that in the past. In the past, I was nothing. In 100 years, maybe I'll be nothing. Again, if everything goes well. These are what Plato calls forms. The idea of these pointing towards is the idea of what Plato calls forms. This word also gets translated as ideas. It's not as good of a translation, but the word also gets translated as idea too. Okay. What are these things? These are the standards or measures by which things are what they are. So what am I? I am a human. Why? Because what it is to be a human is something, and I live up to that standard. And that's why I'm not a cat. Why am I not a cat? Because what it is to be a cat is something, and I don't live up to that standard. And I don't live up to the standard of dinosaur. I don't live up to the standard of unicorn. I don't live up to the standard of square circle. I also don't live up to the standard of fluent in French. I do most of the time live up to the standard of fluent in English. And I sort of live up to the standard of fluent in Greek. I can read it if you give me a really good dictionary. I can read ancient Greek. These standards themselves are not spatial or temporal things. They are aspatial and atemporal. And we saw that, right? Like the questions you all were asking were exactly the right questions to this extent. Why is it that we can still say the sentence dinosaurs do not exist and that sentence remains true even though there are no dinosaurs for us to look at? Because the extinction of the dinosaurs did not make the idea of dinosaur go extinct. The form of dinosaur is just fine. The form of dinosaur was fine before there were dinosaurs. The form of dinosaur will be fine after there are dinosaurs, and it was fine when they were dinosaurs. It's why it was true to say that there are dinosaurs when there were some, and it's true why now it is true to say that there are no dinosaurs. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, but the idea or the idea of dinosaur has changed over time. It has evolved over time.
Our idea of dinosaur has changed over time. The form of dinosaur has not, right? And in principle, what's at least the hope? Our hope is that we've gotten a better grasp of what dinosaurs really were like. There really is something that dinosaurs were like, though. And we're trying to bring ourselves into conformity with it in understanding dinosaurs. So when we thought dinosaurs were scaly lizards, right, we were just wrong. Our idea of dinosaurs didn't match up with the form of dinosaurs that exists out there in reality. These forms are something that exist out there in the world. They're not products of our mind for Plato. Let me start erasing some of the stuff. Indeed, our goal, what is it for humans to know something? It's when the idea in my mind corresponds with the form that's out there in reality. And that's why our ideas change, but hopefully at least our ideas are getting better. What it means to say that they're getting better is that they're more and more closely corresponding with the actual forms that are governing reality itself. Right? These forms govern reality for Plato. They determine what things are and what kinds of things are possible. And they're atemporal in the sense that everything already exists in principle. It's just a question of whether or not we actually find it when we're walking around in the world. Every species that could ever possibly exist, there's already a form of it, right? It already, like, the possibility of it's already out there somewhere. The forms are the possibility of things existing. And this is also true about things that humans have made, Plato even says. Human pieces of technology. I'm very sorry, Steve Jobs, you did not invent the computer. You just discovered it. Because the possibility of computers was always out there. That was always a possibility in reality. He just discovered that possibility, or not even he didn't do it, right? But you know what I mean. Whoever the people at the groundwork of discovering computers, it was a discovery, not an invention. Humans can't invent stuff. We can just discover possibilities that are already out there, latent in the world, in some sense. How are you doing? Is this idea of form? Is this idea making some preliminary degree of sense to people? I'm sure you got questions. So don't hesitate to ask some questions. Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Doesn't this kind of assume determinism, though? Because if everything that is ever going to exist is already a potentiality, I mean, doesn't that require an assumption of determinism, or am I misreading that?
So it's a really good question, and one that I'm not going to be able to do anywhere near enough justice to do today. Again, take medieval. we can do it there. The shorthand version of it, at least, is that at least what people normally mean by determinism, it's not really clear how that would apply. Because the forms aren't causes in the way that one atom bumping into another atom is a cause. Normally when people are talking about determinism, that's what they mean, right? Like, if you look at what all the atoms in the universe are doing, we can predict with perfect knowledge from sort of a prior state what the future state's going to look like. And that tends to be what people mean by determinism. At the very least, that's not applicable in this arena at all. The forms are indeed supposed to be causes, but they're causes in a very odd sense. Right? They're not a physical thing bumping into another thing. It's not like there are forms inside of me. That's not true either. So certainly Plato is not a libertarian thinker. So certainly that's true. So by determinism, we just mean not libertarian freedom. That's going to be certainly correct. But it's also not really clear how nicely that will match on the modern ideas of determinism either. Determinism really comes out of nominalism, which is the anti-Platonic metaphysics. That emerges. It doesn't really emerge out of, this is probably the closest thing is what Aquinas is talking about. It's actually probably the closest, where it's sort of neither determinism nor libertarian freedom exactly that Aquinas is talking about. He's talking about something that's just different and weird in comparison to either of them. So I hope that at least is a good enough. I mean, one cool thing that, if you want to follow up? You should be unmuted.
No. That's actually a good answer. So, well, okay, one follow-up.
Yeah.
So our modern ideas of like determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism wouldn't match up to the ancient Greek ideas of those same things.
That's right.
Okay, good.
There's no notion in Greek or Roman Latin, at least Roman Latin anyway, that translates to our idea of free will. Or even just will in general, actually. Particularly in Greek, there's no word that even approximates our word will. The closest is this word "bulasthai" that just means really to desire something or to want something. So yeah, the conceptual framework is just so different that I don't think it's a particular, I just tend to think the free will determinism debate is just not a really helpful one to use to make sense of what's going on in the ancient world. The conceptual framework is so other, in a sense, to the modern one that it just doesn't neatly map onto anything. And when we talk about Plotinus in a few minutes, we'll see that even more clearly, the way in which he's gonna say his one or God is free, but it's free in a very weird sense. Like it's not free in anything resembling the normal sense of what we mean by it. So yeah, I hope that's at least helpful as a rough framework of an answer, at least, if not all the specifics of one. Right. Let's say a few more things. And again, don't hesitate. Send me the chat notice or put your thumbs up, and I'll find you with more questions. So, but let's say a few more things about these forms. Right, this is the key thing. The forms are, or are beings, in the proper sense of the word being, according to Plato. Right. Why? This is the key, and again, this is one of the key places where we're going to be tempted to misread him on this point, and where I think Nietzsche is misreading him on this point. Why is it that forms are, or why should we call these forms being? And why should we not call, and to make this point more vivid, the spatiotemporal dinosaur, say, in only a derivative sense. Right. So we're getting this two worlds, right? We're saying there's something inadequate about spatiotemporal dinosaurs. It's only the form of dinosaurs that's real in some sense. So we're trying to put all this into Nietzsche language. But why is Plato actually saying this? He's saying it because when you say the word is, right, being, remember, that's just being is just the word is, to be in English. It's just the noun form of the verb to be, right? The reason for this is that sentences that are said about the forms are just true in a way that sentences about spatiotemporal dinosaurs aren't unqualifiedly true. When I say the sentence, dinosaurs are, I want to underline the verb, dinosaurs are winged, not scaled animals, that sentence is just true without spatiotemporal qualifications. I don't have to add the same kind of sentences, qualifications, that I have to make the sentences I say about spatiotemporal dinosaurs. That sentence is only true when I qualify where in space and time I'm talking about Fred the dinosaur. Plus all the other qualifications, perhaps, that we were talking about earlier, too. Things you say about spatiotemporal things. Plato's fundamentally when he's talking about being, Plato's just talking about saying true sentences like, that is a dinosaur. That is a dinosaur is only a true sentence in a highly qualified way, when I qualify it spatially and temporally. Now, it really is a true sentence, but it requires qualification. Sentences that you say about the forms don't require the same qualifications, so they just do this verb, right? This verb to be, this verb is. It just does the verb better. It does the verb without having to qualify it. They are without qualification, right? What we're talking about here, being for Plato means predication. forms are what they are without qualification. Spatiotemporal things only are what they are with various sorts of qualifications. What it is to be human is always to have two legs. What it is to be this human here, unfortunately, life could go bad for me and one could go away. I could lose one. I'd still be a human being, but I would have lost something crucial about being a human, right? And indeed, it would be, I'd notice it. Like, right, if I lost, I've always thought about how horrible it would be to lose a hand. We're such handed people. And all right now on the screen, it's funny, like half of you right now are doing something with your hands. We're so handed. That's so part of what it is to be human. And yet, whoosh, I could lose this one. And that would suck. It wouldn't just be, I guess we wouldn't say like, I guess I'm not human anymore. You would just say like, I've lost something about my humanity. That hasn't harmed the form human being though. The form human being is still indeed a thing that has two hands. Right? Two hands are part of what it is to be a human. I've now in some sense fallen short of humanness. And it's gonna suck because I'm gonna want to do things like pick stuff up, and my whole body is oriented to me having the capacity to pick stuff up, and now I'm not gonna be able to do it. This is the sense in which spatiotemporal things for Plato are deficient or they fall short of forms. They fall short of the forms because they can just not live up to the standard that they should live up to, that the form is. This also applies ethically, by the way. What is being a bad person for Plato? It literally, he just means by it, you're not humaning very well. There is something that it is to be a good human being, and you're just failing at it. Right? And it's not that you're failing at it so badly that you've become dead, and you're not failing at it so badly that you've become a cat, but you failed at it badly enough that what you are is failing to be a human being well. You're being a bad human being. And again, it's actually as bad in the Nietzsche sense. This isn't bad in the master morality sense. This isn't bad in the, like, you're not necessarily evil. The idea of evil actually doesn't really even make sense in this Platonic framework. Right? The sense is just like you're falling short of the form, and that sucks for you. And indeed, like, it does. If you're sick, yeah, that sucks for you. Right? You're not going to be able to do things that in principle human beings are capable of doing. And that sucks for you. That is bad. And there are ways of doing that where it's not your fault, right? Someone could just chop my arm off. But then there are ways I could fall short of being human where it is my fault. I could allow my fear to overwhelm me and become cowardly. And then I will have fallen short of the human capacity of reacting to fear in the appropriate way. I will have become a coward. I will have acquired the vice of cowardice by falling short of the form of human being, and also by falling short of the form of courage, too. Right. How are we doing with all this? Is this making any sort of preliminary sense? Some key things to note here. One, Plato's not saying this because the Bible says he needs to. He's years before the Bible, right? Right, William, go ahead. You're not unmuting for some reason.
Oh,
there you
good?
go. It's good now.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I wanted to touch on, so you mentioned that like a bad human would not only be not fulfilling the form of a human, but if say he was a coward, he wouldn't be fulfilling the form of courage. And
Right.
so like the form of courage and the form of being a good human are interrelated in some way.
Indeed. Yep.
It kind of almost seems a little bit like structuralism. Would you say that it makes that same sort of, right? Because if being a human is like the sum of all of like these other different parts of like being courage, being healthy, you know,
That's
and all.
the difference. It's not the sum of all the other parts.
Okay.
Because other things could be courageous too besides humans, maybe. If there's other rational animals out there, they could be courageous too.
Right.
So it's not, being human is something very distinct from being courageous. But humans are also the sort of thing that can be courageous. We can also the sort of thing that can be cowardly though too.
Mm.
And again, I don't know how all that fits within structuralism exactly.
Yeah.
Structuralism is more that sort of, and I don't know it super well, but from what I know of structuralism, at least, it more seems to be that just like you are sort of like the sum of the sort of substructures that make up something, and this is not really that. Like what it is to be human, that is something. What it is to be courageous is something. Those two things, just what they are such that they're related to each other in some context.
Okay, yeah. So if you take away all of the extraneous stuff that might make up humanity, there would still be something fundamentally human left.
That's right. There is
Okay.
what it is to be human. And indeed, there is what it is to be human as can be studied by a variety of different humans. Biology will study that thing and give us one answer to what it is to be human. They'll maybe talk about a particular range of DNA expressions. But ethics will give us a different answer. Politics maybe gives us a different one still, right? And all of that's even fine, again, but what are all those different sciences looking at? They're looking at the form human being. When we're trying to understand the world, we try to understand the world only incidentally by actually looking at the human beings around us. What we're looking at, where we're using those human beings we see around us, what we're using them for is they're using them as examples to figure out what the form human being is actually like. Does that work?
Let's see. Yes, yes.
All right, good. Yeah, because you're putting up another really important thing we can say about these forms. They're the source of all knowledge. If I look at just like one human, I'm not going to know what it is to be a human being. I'm going to get confused and think, oh, humans have to be things that, in my case, are bald. But I'm wrong. That's just accidental. That's not really essential to what it is to be human, that they be bald, right? As all of you demonstrate with all of your hair. I see you over there, David. No, you still beat me. You still beat me in the hair club. Right? That's just not actually what it is to be human. And I'm going to get confused if I just look around at various humans, right? What I need to do is look at various humans, but figure out by looking at lots of them what is essentially human. And that's grasping the form. That's not grasping a spatiotemporal object. That's grasping this form of human being. And the same with every other science. In math, what you are doing is grasping the form of numbers, and you're looking at the form of numbers. In physics, what are you doing? Plato is actually one of the sort of, in a very weird sense, Newton and Galileo, when they're trying to defend modern physics against the church, they use Plato to do it, weirdly. Because Plato is saying, like, no, to really understand the world, you'd have to understand it mathematically, say. Understand its mathematical properties. And when Newton and Galileo are using math as this new foundation for physics, a lot of people are really opposed to it because they think, no, all you need to do physics is just look at the world. Just look at stuff, and that'll tell you how stuff moves. Them saying, no, you have to go beyond just looking at it. You have to understand its intelligible properties. For example, its mathematical properties. They said, at least, no, that's exactly the same thing that Plato was saying. We're just going back to Plato in doing this. That was part of their defense of themselves in modern physics. All right. Here's another thing we can say about these forms. They're not things you're supposed to have faith in. This is not an arena where faith is relevant. Right? You don't have faith in the forms, you know them. You have knowledge about forms. Hold on just one second. So yeah, there's no holy text that's leading Plato to say any of this, right? Greek religion didn't say anything like this, and anyway, Plato doesn't have anything good to say about Greek religion. He has nothing but bad things. He thinks Greek religion is all impious. He thinks the traditional Greek religion is all impious and blasphemous. So he has nothing good to say about traditional Greek religion, and traditional Greek religion doesn't say any of this. He's not saying any of this because of it. The reason he's saying all of this is because he just thinks this is the best way of just describing the world, right? Notice also, I haven't talked about a world of the forms at all, because Plato never talks about a world of the forms. Plato does not distinguish the supersensible from the sensible world. There's one world that can be described more or less accurately. If I'm describing it inaccurately, I describe it just using my eyes. I just describe it as I see it. If I'm describing it accurately, I describe it in terms of the forms. But that's just one world. Again, when someone like Descartes is doing substance dualism would be, there's two different senses of the word being. There's only one sense of the word being here. If you want to say, what's the real world? The real world is forms. We've mistakenly described this real world as sensible objects, but that's not another world. It's not like there's the sensible world and then some super sensible world out there. There's just one world that we're either describing adequately or we're describing inadequately. Right? That we're saying things that are only perhaps partially true or true in a qualified sense, or we're saying things that are genuinely true about the world. Plato's not pointing to a super sensible world at all. He's pointing to our world described what he says as intelligibly. This is our world described in terms of its intelligible characteristics rather than describing it in terms of its merely sensible characteristics. And the merely sensible characteristics just aren't intelligible. People always compare Plato to Descartes, and I think it's a wildly inadequate comparison. Descartes thinks there's two things, and Descartes thinks there's two worlds. Descartes thinks there's a physical world and a mental world, and he thinks there are different worlds. Plato thinks there's one world, the world, and if you describe that world properly, you're talking about forms. Now the forms themselves are super sensible. You can't see them exactly, right? At least they're not exactly, when you look at something, you are, I guess, seeing forms in a sense, but you're not seeing them as forms. You're gonna be tempted to misinterpret what you see and think that what the world really is composed of is a bunch of just bodies and objects floating around in space or whatever. You can make that mistake, that's fine. So there is indeed, the forms are super sensible, but not because there's a super sensible world. It's because the world itself is really super sensible. The sensible description of the world is just an inadequate one. It's one that doesn't do justice to what the world really is. How are we doing again? Are we okay? Is this making sense? People got questions? Don't hesitate, interrupt me, stop me whenever. Let's do a few more things. I'm going to turn a little bit now from Plato to Plotinus. Plotinus is much later. Plato's in about the 4th century BCE. Plotinus is in around the 3rd century AD. Ish. It's about, so Plotinus is much later, but Plotinus is just claiming he's a student of Plato. He's not claiming he does anything new. He's the one that's more influential even than Plato is actually on the early churches. So I'm a lot of the stuff that I've been framing it more as Plotinus would put it, maybe even how Plato himself would have put it. Let's now turn explicitly to Plotinus and show what this sort of looks like. So according to Plotinus, here is the world. Here's the first way you could describe the world. You could describe the world just in terms of sensation. What do you get if you describe the world this way? Well, you get individual animals, individual objects, instances of justice and injustice, etc. Right? You get all these various sorts of individual things that I indeed can say true sentences about, but that all the truth that I can make about these kinds of things is highly qualified. This is the sensible level. But I don't have to describe the world this way. I could describe the world intelligibly, Plotinus says. What am I going to get here? What I'm going to get here is forms. And these forms themselves are going to be described in a variety of different ways. There's going to be a variety of different ways I can describe the forms. I can just talk about forms insofar as they do things. This one in particular should be highly vague. This is what Plotinus calls soul. But I can describe forms insofar as they relate to one another. He calls this intellect. Or mind, you could translate it the word as maybe. And then there's the forms as they are in themselves. Right. He calls this the one, or the good. Right. And so these are different ways of describing the world. It's just one world described under a variety of different aspects. But what it suggests is sort of a hierarchy of interpretations. So what is the world truly? The world is what he calls the one or the good. Right? And if you're Christianity, just scratch out one of those O's. And you've got what Christianity calls it. Right? You can call it God. Then below that, there's what he calls intellect. We have all the relationships that exist between forms. Then below that is soul, the forms doing things with spatiotemporal objects. And then finally, at the very, very bottom, the worst possible interpretation I could give to the world, I could describe the world as made up of spatiotemporal objects. And it's just a few little notes. When Plotinus talks about being, he reserves it for this level. Being is reserved for the level of intellect, because that's the realm where we're just talking about the forms and relationship to one another, right? He calls this bottom level, he calls it becoming, for reasons we don't need to really go into, but he calls this bottom level but the world insofar as it's becoming, right? All right. So this sort of hierarchy that we're laying out, right? These are different ways of interpreting the world. Where are you? I'm going to bring it back up for a second. So just that you should all be able to unmute yourself. So just unmute yourself. Where are you? What are you? Are you a spatiotemporal object? Do you belong here? Do you belong here? Do you belong here? Or do you belong up here? Where do you belong? Well, let's do it step by step. Do you have a body? Okay. So insofar as you have a body, you know where you belong? Here. But is that body any old body, or is it a human body doing human things? Are you the same thing basically as just like, are you just like a lump of stuff? Or are you a body that's a human body doing human stuff? Is that true to say of you? Okay, so if you're that, guess where you belong? You're a soul, to that extent. But are you just a body doing human stuff, or are you a human being, right? And in that regard, no different from any other human being. Well, yeah. So to that extent, do you know where you are? You're here. But where does all of that come from? All of that comes from this top level. So guess where you are? You're there too. You are a highly ambiguous thing. What you refers to is not at all clear. I could put you at any level I wanted to put you at. More importantly, you could put yourself at any level you wanted to put yourself at. If you want to live a life of a mere body, go ahead. Eat lots of food, have lots of sex, more power to you. If you want to put your life, if you want to understand yourself as soul, go ahead, you can do that. Engage in important, meaningful human activities, take part in politics, form friendships, do that. If you want to understand yourself as something that can know, that can understand what the world really is that being word, go ahead, understand yourself in that way, your mind. And if you understand what that mind really is, what you are is God. You are the one that is beyond being, the one that it's impossible to talk about because it's the source of the forms, and so therefore is not itself a form. Neoplatonism is mysticism. What matters is what you identify yourself as, what you make yourself most closely resemble. And the big punchline here, and again, all this is highly schematic, so you should have many questions about the specifics of all of this. And again, come take medieval with me and we'll go way more in depth with all of this. Big punchline, the highest thing you could identify yourself with is God. What is the goal of Platonic philosophy? The goal of Platonic philosophy is not to say a bunch of true stuff. You do that when you're doing Platonic philosophy. Along the way, you say some true stuff. But the goal is not even to understand the world. What is the goal of Platonic philosophy? Plotinus is very straightforward. The goal of his thought is for you to become God, to become unified with God, to identify yourself with that which already speaks of the source of all things within you. Or if you want, you could identify yourself, just as some random body and go around rubbing your body against other bodies that generate some pleasure for you. Or go around stuffing some other bodies into your mouth body and just get some pleasure that way. You could be that, I guess, if you want. Like, if you want, knock yourself out. You could just be, because you're that, you really are that too, right? That's just as true to describe you in some sense. You are a body. And again, if you want to be a political thing, great, identify yourself as soul, be that. But the highest thing you could be is through attaining knowledge, through the study of philosophy, you could understand the actual structure of the world, and so therefore understand, or get a glimpse of, maybe not understand, get a glimpse of the actual source of the world, and be that. God is not something different from everything else. This is what's called panentheism. All things are one in God. If any of you know Eastern religions, you might be thinking, hey, this sounds a lot like Hinduism. If you're thinking that, you are indeed right. Plotinus was a legionary in the Roman army, went to India and studied with some yogis. So you are indeed not at all mistaken. And indeed, I have read several modern Hindu texts that use Neoplatonic philosophy to articulate what it is that they're saying. Does Christianity talk about becoming unified with God? Yes, it does. Because what is the goal of the Gospels? What does Christ say is the goal of the Gospels? The goal is for all of us to become sons of God. But who is the Son of God? Christ. And what is Christ? God. Attain unity with God through Christ. You know what else I just drew up on the board? Hey, how many of these things that aren't bodies are there? There's one. Hey, soul. Is there another word for soul? Maybe ghost? Hey, intellect. Is there another word for that? Maybe the logos, or the word, or the son? The one or the God. Oh, is that maybe the Godhead, the Father? Father, Son, Ghost. Guess what could not have been more thrilled to read some Plotinus? The Church Fathers. Fathers of the Christian Church could not have been more thrilled. Because Plotinus's goal is not to establish Christianity. Plotinus, too, has no holy book. He thinks all of this is just necessary to give an adequate account of how you're able to say sentences like, my cat is really fast. That's sort of how, like, it's important to just remember where all of this is coming from, right? Because we've gotten galaxy brain. Why did we get galaxy brain, though? This is just coming, all of this is coming from is literally Plato's effort to explain why is the sentence, my cat is really fast, why is that a true sentence? Whether his metaphysics is right or wrong is a separate issue. But that's what he's trying to do. That's the whole point of his metaphysics, is to answer that question and questions of that sort. Why are we able to say true sentences? What is it that allows a sentence to be true in the first place? And from that standpoint, these Platonist thinkers, they developed this whole elaborate transcendent world, right? This whole way of talking about transcendence, but they're not talking about a distinction between a sensible and a supersensible world. That's going to be something that Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and actually even the pagans, turned what they're saying into. No supersensible world here. We're going to get us a supersensible world when we divide a line between these two things. A line that the Platonists themselves don't draw. How are we doing with all this? This is a lot. This is a lot, and I threw a lot at you. And it's highly schematic. I mean, all of this, you should have many questions about how all of this is supposed to be working in practice. And again, take medieval philosophy, and I will answer your questions. We will spend a month just on Plotinus, because he's that important to medieval thought. All right. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments? I'm good with ending here. This is a pretty good place to end, I think, for today. All right. Then if we're good for today, what we're going to do next time, one important thing to note, we haven't really said anything at all about religion, what these Platonists mean by religion, and we're not going to. We'll do that on Thursday, because as we're going to see, what they mean by religion is incredibly weird. They're actually not going to define religion in terms of transcendence. They're going to define religion as politics. So we'll see that next on Thursday. What we're going to do on Tuesday, I want us to look at how early Jewish thought, Christian thought, and to a lesser extent, but still there in Islamic thought, how all of these early traditions use Platonism to define their own sort of like intellectual space. They use the ideas of Platonic thought, they transform them noticeably, and we'll talk about those transformations too, but they use it to define something that more closely resembles what Nietzsche was talking about. That's going to be our goal for next time. So any last questions, thoughts, or comments? All right. Thank you all very much. We had a lot of listening to me just yammer on today. Hope it was intelligible. This was not easy stuff by any stretch of the imagination. We've got 3 readings for next time. They're all really short, so just pick one of them for the daily assignment. Just you pick whichever one you like. The longest is probably Dionysius the Areopagite, and he's going to be the weirdest too. So he'll probably be the one we mostly talk about, but we'll talk about the other 2 as well. All right. Have a good one. Have a great weekend, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Hopefully we'll have most of your papers done by then too. Maybe not all of them, but I hopefully will at least have made really good progress in getting the papers done by that point as well. All right. Have a wonderful one. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
You too.